All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be taking a look at something pretty cool, and I know you guys have been asking about this. This is all about bioluminescence.
Yeah.
Specifically, we're going to be focusing on anthozoa, specifically octocorals. So think soft corals, gorgonians, and sea pens.
Right. Some of the more charismatic groups.
Yeah, definitely. You know, you sent me a bunch of stuff, but there's a really interesting paper here, Evolution of Bioluminescence in Anthozoa, with emphasis on Octocorallia, and that's kind of where we're gonna focus this deep dive. And I know you have a lot of experience with this, so I'm excited to kind of unpack this with you.
Yeah, this will be fun.
So for our listeners who maybe aren't as familiar with this, what exactly is bioluminescence? Like, how would you describe it in simple terms?
Well, bioluminescence is basically just the production of light from a living organism through a chemical reaction. It's actually pretty common in the marine environment, especially in the deep sea. It's used for a variety of reasons, from communication to defense, even finding food.
Okay, so I guess our mission today is to understand, like, when did this evolve in Anthozoa and maybe particularly within octocorals?
Yeah, and what does that tell us about their evolutionary history? How they've diversified and how they've adapted, especially to environments like the deep sea.
Okay, cool. So let's start by looking at how widespread bioluminescence is across the whole group of Anthozoa. I know there are two main classes, right? You have Octocorallia and Hexacorallia.
Yeah, those are the two big branches, right? And they actually split a long time ago. We're talking like 770 million years ago. And bioluminescence pops up in both groups.
Hmm. Okay, interesting. So it's not just like a one-time thing that happened in one group or the other.
No, it seems to have evolved independently in both groups. And actually, if you look at Hexacorallia, it's a lot less common. It's mostly found in some of the early diverging lineages, things like Zoantharia and Actiniaria, basically sea anemones.
Right.
But overall, there just aren't that many records of bioluminescence in hexacorals.
So like the reef-building corals and things like that, they don't really have bioluminescence.
Right, so there's no records in groups like Cerantheria, Anthopatheria, Corallomorpharia, and Scleractinia. Those are the big ones. I mean, there's a single, maybe dubious record from an Anthopatherian, and a luciferase-like gene was found in a Cerantherian, but that's about it.
Interesting. So it's really like a tiny, tiny fraction of those species.
Yeah.
Okay, so then if we shift over to Octocorallia, is it kind of a different story?
Oh, yeah, it's a very different story. Bioluminescence is much more common in octocorals, especially in a group called the Sclerocyanacea. That's an order that's often found in deep water, so you get a lot more bioluminescent species down there.
So does that mean it's present in all octocorals, or is it still kind of like a scattered
Well,
distribution?
no, it's not in every single species.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because there's another order, the Malacalcyanacea, where there are hardly any confirmed records of bioluminescence. So it seems like it was lost or never really took hold in that group.
Okay, so it's still like a bit of a puzzle.
Yeah, exactly. And this paper actually adds a few more pieces to that puzzle because they report some new observations of bioluminescence. For example, they found it in two species of zoanthids, Buligomezoanthus, Amelia cadiarum, and Corallozoanthus. They also found it in 5 octocoral species.
Oh, wow. Like totally new discoveries.
Yeah, Chrysogorgia tricollis, Chrysogorgia cf chrysace, Iridogorgia cf splendens, Metallogorgia cf melanotrichos, and a few species of Keratocididae, those bamboo corals, and then also Echinophyllum mycontoshi, the sea pen. And you know what's really cool about that is for several of these, it's the first report of bioluminescence for the entire genus.
Huh. That's pretty remarkable. So they're really expanding our knowledge of which groups have this ability.
Yeah, exactly. So now we have, more complete list, and it turns out that there are 8 genera of Hexacorallia that are known to be bioluminescent and a whopping 32 genera in Octocorallia.
Okay, so that's a pretty big difference.
It is.
So that kind of highlights where the action is in terms of bioluminescence.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so this paper, it wasn't just about like cataloging species. They also looked at the evolutionary origins of bioluminescence, right?
Yeah, that was a big focus of the study, particularly in octocorals.
Right.
And they used some pretty sophisticated techniques like phylogenomic analysis and ancestral state reconstruction to basically trace the history of bioluminescence back through time.
Okay, so what did they find? Like, where did it all begin?
Well, the most interesting finding is that they strongly suggest that bioluminescence originated only once in Octocorallia.
Hmm. Okay.
So that means there was like one ancestral octocoral that was bioluminescent, and then all the other bioluminescent species that we see today are descended from that one ancestor.
That's pretty cool that it all traces back to a single origin.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And they were also able to estimate when that origin happened, which is even more mind-blowing. They put it at around the Cambrian period, about 540 million years ago.
Whoa, 540 million years. So that means octocorals were already glowing back when the very first animals were evolving.
Exactly. And get this. Their estimate has a range. It could be anywhere between 463 to 624 million years ago.
Wow.
But, no matter how you slice it, that is ancient. I mean,
Yeah.
the previous oldest record for bioluminescence in the marine environment was from ostracods, those tiny crustaceans. And that was only around 267 million years ago.
So this basically doubles the known age of marine bioluminescence.
Yep.
That's a huge discovery. I mean, it really changes our understanding of how early animals might have been interacting with each other and their environment. Like if bioluminescence was already around back then, it could have played a major role in shaping early ecosystems.
Totally. It could have influenced predator-prey relationships, communication strategies, who knows what else. We're talking about a time when animal life was just starting to diversify, and bioluminescence could have been a key part of that story.
Yeah, it really opens up a lot of new questions and possibilities.
It does. And, the study also found that while there was that single origin, bioluminescence was subsequently lost in some lineages.
Okay, so it's not like it just appeared and then every octocoral from then on was bioluminescent.
Right. Like evolution isn't just about gaining traits. Sometimes it's about losing them if they're not useful anymore.
Yeah, that makes sense. So,
Hmm.
so where were their losses?
Well, one interesting case is the Malacalcinacea. Remember, that's the group where there are very few bioluminescent species today. The study couldn't definitively say whether the ability to produce light was lost very early in their evolution or whether there were multiple independent losses. It's still a bit of a mystery.
Okay, so there's more work to be done there to figure that out.
Yeah,
What about the scleral cyanacea? That's the group where bioluminescence is really common, right?
exactly. And the study supports the idea that their ancestor was also bioluminescent. Within that group, there are some confirmed cases of losses, like in the families Corallidae, Primnoidae, and Virgularidae.
Those are all deep sea groups, right?
Well, Corallidae are actually shallow water corals, the ones they make jewelry out of. But the other two, yeah, they're deep sea groups. But on the flip side, some families that have a ton of bioluminescent species today, like Panachuloidea, the sea pens, Chrysogorgiidae, the gold corals, and Keratoisidea, the bamboo corals, they probably all inherited bioluminescence from their ancestors.
Okay, so it seems like once that ability evolved, it was often retained, at least in certain lineages.
Yeah, that's what the evidence suggests.
And I know the study also looked at how bioluminescence is related to depth, like where these corals live.
Yeah, they were interested in seeing if there were any patterns there, and there definitely are.
Okay, tell me about that.
Well, they found that the most recent common ancestor of all octocorals was most likely a shallow water species. And the same thing for the ancestor of Malacalcinacea. But then things get interesting with scleral cyanacea.
Oh, how so?
Well, their ancestor might have been adapted to a wider range of depths, including the deep sea. And actually, if you remove one species, Cornellaria pabloi, from the analysis, the probability of a deep sea origin for scleral cyanacea increases even more.
Huh, that's interesting. So maybe this Cornellaria species is kind of an outlier in that group.
Yeah, it's possible. And then when you look at the families with lots of bioluminescent species, like Keratoisididae, Chrysogorgiidae, and the whole superfamily Panachuloidea, the sea pens, their ancestors also had a high probability of being deep sea dwellers.
So it seems like there's a connection there, like maybe evolving in the deep sea made bioluminescence more likely to stick around.
Yeah, and it makes sense. In the deep sea, there's no sunlight, so bioluminescence could be super useful for finding food, attracting mates, defending yourself, all sorts of things.
Right. And the study actually found that bioluminescent octocorals are most abundant between 500 and 2,000 meters deep, with another peak around 3,300 meters.
Exactly. That supports the idea that bioluminescence is particularly advantageous in the deep sea. And it's not just that deep sea species have bioluminescence. The study also points out that some bioluminescent lineages that originated in the deep sea have actually moved back into shallower habitats. So it's not a one-way street.
Huh. So maybe bioluminescence is kind of like a versatile tool that can be useful in a variety of environments.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so we've talked about when bioluminescence evolved and where it's found. Now I'm curious about why. Like, what were the evolutionary drivers behind this ability?
Well, the study discusses a few interesting hypotheses. One idea is that bioluminescence might have initially evolved not for communication or defense, but as a way to detoxify against oxygen or reactive oxygen species, ROS.
Oh, interesting. So like a way to deal with the harmful effects of oxygen.
Exactly. And the light emission would just be a byproduct of that process.
Huh. So light as a side effect of survival.
Yeah. And this ties in with the fact that oxygen levels were increasing around the Cambrian period, when bioluminescence first appeared in octocorals. So it's possible that organisms were under pressure to develop new ways to deal with oxygen toxicity.
That's a pretty neat idea.
It is. And there's another interesting possibility that this study brings up. They suggest that the Ranella-type luciferases, the enzymes that catalyze the bioluminescent reaction in many octocorals, might actually be related to bacterial haloalkane dehalogenases.
Whoa, hold on. So you're saying that corals might have borrowed a gene from bacteria to produce light?
Yeah, that's the idea. It's called horizontal gene transfer, and it's actually more common than you might think.
Wow, that's amazing.
So it's possible that corals didn't even evolve bioluminescence on their own, but they got a helping hand from bacteria.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's a really cool idea. And the study goes on to propose that bioluminescence might have been co-opted from other functions, like antioxidant activity, and then became more widespread in the deep sea, where there's less ROS production because metabolic rates are lower.
Okay, so maybe it was like a pre-adaptation that proved to be really useful in the deep sea.
Exactly.
But I know there are still a lot of unknowns when it comes to bioluminescence, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. The researchers acknowledge that there are limitations to their study. For example, for a lot of anthozoan species, we just don't know if they're bioluminescent or not. It's hard to observe in the wild, especially in the deep sea.
Yeah, makes sense.
And even if you collect a species and you don't see any light, it could be that it just wasn't producing light at that moment or that the stress of collection interfered with its bioluminescence.
Right, so it's kind of hard to get a complete picture.
It is. But even when they analyze the data, treating all the unknown species as non-bioluminescent, the main finding still held up, that the ancestor of octocorals was most likely bioluminescent.
Okay, so the evidence is still pretty strong.
It is.
Yeah.
And, we also have to remember that bioluminescence requires two main components: luciferase, the enzyme that triggers the reaction, and coelentrazine, the molecule that actually emits the light. And this study points out that while we've identified luciferase genes in bioluminescent octocorals, we don't actually know if they can synthesize coelentrazine themselves.
Huh. So where would they get it from?
That's a good question. If their ancestor was bioluminescent and relied on coelentrazine, it must have gotten it from somewhere, maybe his diet. But we don't know for sure.
Yeah.
That's another area where more research is needed.
Definitely. Okay, so let's circle back to the two main classes of Anthozoa, Hexacorallia, and Octocorallia. We talked about how bioluminescence is a lot less common in Hexacorallia. Do we have any ideas why that might be?
Well, the study suggests that maybe Hexacorallia evolved a different genetic mechanism for bioluminescence. It could be that a way they produce light is totally different from how octocorals do it.
Okay.
And it's interesting to note that in hexacorals, bioluminescence seems to be mostly found in those early diverging groups, like Zoantharia, that don't have a hard skeleton.
Which is thought to be the ancestral state for Anthozoa, right? Like the first Anthozoans probably didn't have skeletons.
Exactly. So it's possible that bioluminescence was present in the very first anthozoans and then was lost in some lineages as they evolved skeletons.
This makes sense.
And there's another interesting observation from the study. They found that bioluminescent zoanthids often live on other invertebrates, like corals and sponges, while non-bioluminescent zoanthids tend to grow on bare rock.
Oh, that's cool. So maybe the bioluminescence is somehow involved in those relationships.
Yeah, that's what they think. It could be that the light attracts beneficial organisms or deters harmful ones, but we need more research to figure out exactly how it works.
Definitely.
Ultimately, the study suggests that to understand why bioluminescence is so much less common in hexacorals, we need to learn more about the specific advantages it provides in different species and environments.
Okay, so basically there's still a lot we don't know, but this research is a huge step forward in understanding the evolution of bioluminescence in Anthozoa. And for me, the biggest takeaway is that this ability is ancient. I mean, 540 million years old, that's mind-boggling. It really highlights how much evolutionary history is packed into these creatures.
Yeah, it's amazing to think that these seemingly simple animals have been producing light for so long. It really changes our perspective on the deep sea and its inhabitants.
It does. It makes you wonder what other secrets are hiding down there, just waiting to be discovered.
Absolutely. And for anyone listening who wants to learn more about this, I highly recommend checking out the paper we've been discussing. It's called Evolution of Bioluminescence in Anthozoa, with emphasis on Octocorallia, and it was published in Proceedings of the Royal Society B.
Great recommendation. And with that, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time.